Welcome again to the second and final of these two talks on grant and fellowship writing. In this talk, I will focus on writing at a more detailed level, looking at the section, the paragraph, and the sentence. And in each case, I'll be trying to show how the simple strategies that we use in stories can help us here as well. First up, I will focus on one section in particular, the one that is probably the single most important part of your proposal. It stretches from here, the big issue, to your research question. It will not only be the heart of the biggest section of your proposal, section 11, but you will be summarising it in your abstract and elsewhere in the proposal. Now, your research question or problem is the pivotal point of your whole proposal. But from getting to the start to the research question, there are two mistakes commonly made. One serious and one not so serious. First, where the writing is what I call scrambled, and second, where it lacks sufficient emphasis for its big points. In what I call scrambled writing, as one goes from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph, there is no overall coherent structure, story or otherwise. The information is presented like a jigsaw that's been thrown on the floor. As a writer, you can mentally put it back together again quite easily, but the readers can't. Now, I should mention that for the rest of this talk, I'll need more space for the actual content, so I'll be off screen. Now, if we have a scrambled introduction, how can we fix it, or even better still, avoid it? To answer this question, I first need to give you some more detail about one aspect of stories that I only mentioned briefly in the first talk, the hero. Now, every story has a hero we identify with, and they face some major problem. But storytellers take quite a while to introduce their heroes before they face that problem. In fact, in most movies, for example, the main obstacle only appears at about the 25% point of the overall screen time. Up until that point, we are learning about the world the hero lives in, which can take many forms, of course. For example, in some particular movie, we might find out that out of all the world, our hero lives in France, and not just anywhere there, but Paris. And then somewhere specific in Paris, in the artist district, Montmartre, the Moulin Rouge, back in the 19th century. And so we come to our particular hero, not of the recent Moulin Rouge film, but the 1950s version about the life of the famous artist, Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, all this contextualizing helps us to understand and identify strongly with our hero, so that when their problem comes, it's something that we care about. Otherwise, it just won't raise the necessary scoreline-like questions. Will the hero overcome the problem? How will the hero overcome it? Now, in research, we also have to do the same type of scene setting if we want our readers to worry about our question. We need the same contextualizing with the hero of our proposal. Now, you just might be scratching your heads at this point, wondering, who is my hero? Well, it's actually very easy to work out. We just work backwards, knowing what we know about stories. Story structure tells us that the hero is the thing that has the problem. And in research, we know that the generic form of a problem is the knowledge gap. So the hero must be that which has the knowledge gap. And that is, of course, your model. Your model is your hero, and the knowledge gap in the model is the obstacle. Now, to see this contextualizing in practice, let's look at an example from research. And as we consider it, I will also be showing you a strategy that I've found to help people quite a lot when they are writing up the early section of a proposal or paper. Now, here's our model, our hero. It's a simple clinical trial type of hypothesis. And it is the drug D could alleviate the symptoms of disease X. Now, a clinical trial is a lot simpler, of course, than the sort of study you are probably doing, but it will serve our purpose here. Now, drug D has not yet been tested on humans, so that's our knowledge gap. And putting these two things together, we get our research question. Does drug D alleviate the symptoms of disease X? Now, when we want to contextualize a proposal like this, what I'm suggesting is a simple diagrammatic approach, where you start by actually drawing the largest context possible for the model, and then you gradually work your way in. These drawings are not meant to go in the application itself. They are tools to help you write better. So let's imagine that this disease X is regionally specific. Out of the whole world, it's mainly found in India. That's our largest scale. Now, let's zoom into India, where we just happen to find that about 1% of the population is affected. Scale 2. Let's zoom in yet further to some medical research centre in Delhi, where various drug treatments have been tried. Drugs A, B and C were all tested clinically, but they don't work. Then, just last year, our drug D was tested on mice in which the disease had been induced, and drug D completely cured them, thus raising the possibility of treating humans with drug D. So I've found that when researchers start by drawing a system like this, then when they come to write, they are not as likely to scramble things up. And the reason for this is, I think, that when we draw, we are quite used to starting with an outline and then working our way into the details. If I was drawing a cat, for example, and the thing I wanted my viewers to really notice was its amazingly shiny fur, do I start with the fur? No. First, I have to get the body recognizable as a cat, and that's what I start with, just like my outline of my simple mouse here. Now, the drawing first approach also seems to have another benefit. It seems to reduce the impact of one other contributor to scrambled writing, where writers add in lots of unnecessary information that goes off at a tangent to the main line of thinking. The lead up to the research question is not, and I repeat, not a review of the literature. You're only adding in the information that is necessary to help the reader to understand and identify with your hero, your model. So when researchers draw the context, my experience is that they become much more choosy. In their drawing, they only tend to add in what is relevant. And when they come to write, this drawing helps them translate their work to a more streamlined, less scrambled introduction. Now, let's think about a second, perhaps less serious problem, what I call unemphasized writing. Because sometimes, even if the writing is not scrambled at all, and it has all the key points in the right sequence, those points still don't stand out. A musical equivalent of this would be where the bass line is much too soft. We can't feel the rhythm. Now, this is a common problem for many writers, and the main reason for it is as follows. When we're writing or reading what we have just written, we typically speak out the sentences, literally, or at least in our heads. And as we are doing this, we put emphasis on the important parts using a range of verbal strategies. We modulate our voice in various ways, in pitch and volume, and we can also pause before continuing. When we use these strategies in a real conversation, they work perfectly. They draw attention to what we have just said or what we are about to say, and they help the listener interpret the dialogue. But for a writer, as we read our own text aloud to ourselves, we are adding in emphasis that is typically not on the page. And so then we don't recognise the difficulties the reader will have. So how can we add in emphasis? Well, the single most useful strategy at the level of a section is the writing equivalent of a pause, a paragraph break. Just as with speaking, a pause in written text can draw the reader's attention to what they have just read, or are about to read, or both. It creates a block of text that now has a beginning and an end, and we all know that with anything that plays out chronologically, we pay most attention to what happens at the beginning and the end. In a paragraph, readers look for possible key points near the start of the paragraph and in its very final sentence. There are two implications of this. First, put the information that you want to be noticed, the key point, before or after the paragraph break. Second, you can't go too far. If you have too many paragraphs, you run the risk of your readers feeling like they are being shouted at, because the proportion of information that is being emphasised is too high. While still on the subject of pauses, you can also introduce an even bigger pause within a section that has even greater potential emphasis. For example, if your section has 3 subsections, each with, say, 2 or 3 paragraphs each, divided by subheadings, then those breaks between the subsections are megapauses, and the information at the beginning and end of each subsection will be considered by the reader as being potentially of very high significance. There are other ways to add emphasis to text other than a paragraph break. These are more crude, but they can still be effective. You can modulate your writing voice, for example, by using bold text, italics, and underlining. Another strategy is to directly tell your reader that some item of information is particularly important. Or you might specify the role that that information plays in the story. You might say, for example, these findings lead directly to my research question. Does drug D alleviate the symptoms of disease X? As I've said, crude but effective. What we were just considering concerned the relationship between paragraphs within a section. Now let's look at what happens inside a paragraph. And here I'll be thinking about longer paragraphs of at least 5 sentences, which are the most common form in research writing. On the right of the screen now, we have a 7-sentence paragraph in diagrammatic form. I have my own favourite advisors on paragraph structure, Joseph Williams, George Gopin. You can read about them in their own books or in the Joshua Schimmel book, Writing Science. These authors say that there are some features that all long paragraphs should, have, maybe even must have. First up, the topic of the paragraph, what it's all about, should be announced early, usually in sentence 1 or 2, and definitely no later than sentence 3. This is just the same as a regular story, leading up to a point of focus that will then drive the rest of the paragraph. Secondly, all the content that is presented after the topic sentence must nest underneath it. Well, this is sort of like defining what it means to have a topic in the first place, but many people aren't sure about the idea of a topic sentence, so it's useful to state it explicitly. And finally, if the topic sentence is not the very first sentence, then the sentences before it must lead up to it. If we do use such sentences in a paragraph, we're doing just the same type of scene setting that we find in regular stories, and as we also saw in our introductory section. A paragraph is basically a mini-story. Now let's look at a paragraph where the topic sentence is indeed right at the very start. In the last decade, various lines of evidence have indicated that disease X can be caused by high levels of poxamine. First, high levels of poxamine are always reported in people with the disease. Second, high levels of poxamine accompany the development of the disease in mice treated with an activator of poxamine, the drug Q. Most interestingly, the symptoms of the disease in these mice can now be alleviated by a suppressor of poxamine, the drug D. All the information presented after the first sentence here relates back to the relationship between poxamine and disease X. This is a nested paragraph. It cannot be repeated enough that it is a basic expectation of readers that the information in a paragraph is nested. When we start reading a paragraph, we are always scanning the text, consciously or unconsciously, looking for that early sentence that declares what the paragraph is all about. So what would be examples of totally or partly non-nested paragraphs? Well, the most serious case is where there is no topic sentence at all. For example, the paragraph we've just been considering, but without its first topic sentence. So when we look at the sentence that is now first up, first high levels of poxamine, da-da-da-da-da, we don't know what the first is referring back to. It's a puzzle. It's like we have a list of songs and we don't know if all the songs are off a single album or not, or what the album might be. Here we will look at a less serious but still annoying way in which a paragraph can be unnested, in this case partly nested. To illustrate this, I want to introduce one extra sentence into our paragraph and put it in just after our first mention of the drug Q. So the new sentence is, Q is perhaps best known for its surprising ability to rapidly ripen fruit via an unexplained mechanism. Now this fact, while it might be interesting and true, and therefore rather enticing to include in the paragraph, it nevertheless has no connection to the relationship between poxamine and disease X, which is the topic of our paragraph. It should not go in. You must always keep in mind we are not writing a review. Now the topic sentence doesn't have to be the very first sentence. On the screen now we have our main paragraph from before, but in addition, right at the very start, we now have one sentence added that leads us towards our original topic sentence. As noted above, disease X has been intensively studied since 1950 when it was first identified. Now this sentence is great. It helps provide context in the very same way that a grand, overarching theme does in a fictional story. It is connected to what follows, but it isn't what drives everything that follows. The sort of paragraph in which this sentence would be an appropriate topic sentence would be one that tells us about all the research that has happened since 1950, which is obviously not the case here. Having one or two sentences before the topic sentence is quite common in the early part of a big section. But once we get to the meat or the middle of that section, the topic sentence tends to be the first one up. Now, we all know stories vary in the strength of their ending. They can end with a big climax. Other times, they just seem to trail off. Paragraphs are much the same. They can end loudly or softly. The paragraph we've been considering so far has what I would consider a soft ending. That sentence, most interestingly, etc., etc., when the reader comes to that, they will consider it provisionally important because it's the last sentence, perhaps indicating the direction that will be taken further in the following paragraph. And they will also be influenced to think along these lines when they read that phrase at the very start of the sentence, most interestingly, which itself is an example of directly telling the reader what to notice, as I mentioned earlier in the talk. But compare that ending with this one, where the sentence now follows our current final sentence. These results and the similarity of disease X in mice and humans suggest the value of now testing drug D in humans. This sentence is much more dramatic because it does something that the previous final sentence didn't. It takes all the information in the paragraph and draws something new out of it, a conclusion. In terms of emphasis, this type of sentence really stands out because it's both final in its term of location and conclusive in terms of content. If you write the sentence that states your research question, problem in this way, positioned right at the end of the paragraph, then the reviewers won't be able to miss it. And they won't confuse it with other problems or questions you may have mentioned previously. And that is really important. We now come to our smallest unit of interest, the sentence. Now, sentences have several story-like features. I will only look at one of them, but I think it's a very practical insight. It's had a big influence on the way I write, and many people have told me after a workshop that nothing had more impact for them than this one idea. In English, and in fact in most languages of the world, sentences are chronological. Older information, that is more familiar information, occurs at the start of the sentence. And at the end of the sentence, we find newer, less familiar information. As to what is considered familiar or unfamiliar, this is a combination of two things. It includes what the reader can reasonably be expected to have as their general knowledge before they've read the text. But more importantly, it refers back to what you have previously told your readers within the text itself. That is, what you have made familiar to them. Now, this idea of putting familiar information at the start of a sentence, that is first, it seems to make a lot of sense, particularly in research, where we can lose our readers so easily. So you might wonder why writers don't do it naturally. Well, the reason for this is that as the writer, we often become bored with what is familiar. We've been writing about it for days and thinking about it for much longer. So we become scared of also boring our readers. And thus we tend to give prominence to the newer, less familiar information by putting it at the front of the sentence. Other times we might leave it out altogether. But our readers are hardly ever as familiar with the content as we are, and so they get left behind. Let's look at our paragraph one last time. For 3 of the sentences, I have circled the familiar information, and notice that it's always at the front of the sentence. Let's focus in particular on the start of the second last sentence. Most interestingly, the symptoms of the disease in these mice. Now I think you'll realise this phrase is recapitulating the information from the end of the previous sentence. This is a very common and useful way that writers put this familiar first idea into practice. They take what was new information at the end of a previous sentence and use it as a launching pad for the next sentence. I call this the stepping stones approach. Imagine you are using 3 stepping stones to cross a creek. Now you could cross it like this, where you risk getting off balance. Or on the other hand, you can first stabilise on the middle stone, on the familiar information as it were, before making your second move. Now you might feel quite comfortable writing in the first way, which is sort of leaving out the familiar information. But remember this, your readers are not clairvoyant. They don't even know that there is a third stone, as it were, in the distance. They are continually lending you their trust as they move ahead. And if they end up stumbling, they won't be happy with you. So now we've come to the end of these 2 talks. I hope you enjoyed them and learned something that will help you, not only with this application, but with many more in the future. If you do apply these storytelling strategies in your writing, whether it be a proposal or a paper, I think you'll find you have an edge, and you'll also find the process of writing more efficient. Most importantly, if you can make your paper or proposal into a story, you will allow the reader to become immersed in it, so that it becomes much more like they are doing the science itself, rather than just reading about it. And in addition to improving your communication skills, I think you'll also find there's another benefit. It's something I've personally experienced as a working scientist, and it is what makes me most passionate about helping researchers like you to improve their communication skills. As you strive to make your research more accessible to others, you will come to understand it better yourself. You'll become aware of the flaws in your own understanding of the topic, and thus be compelled to learn more about it, both by looking to the resources out there in the world, but also to those important resources that you have in here in your own mind. Good research occurs as much in the head as it does at the bench or in the field, and thinking does not require a budget.